All right, let's take a quick trip back in time to early 2020. You remember, right? The whole world was kind of holding its breath, standing on the edge of a global health crisis that was about to unleash an economic shockwave, something totally unlike anything most of us had ever seen before. So get this. Back in October 2019, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was feeling pretty optimistic. They were predicting a nice, healthy 3.4% growth for the world economy. But just 6 months later, boom. That forecast absolutely plummeted to negative 3%. We're talking a swing of over 6 percentage points. To give you some perspective, that's a bigger economic hit than what was expected during the Great Recession back in '08. Just wow. Economists started calling it the Great Lockdown, and it was this crazy double whammy of a crisis. First, you had what they call an aggregate supply shock. Factories, offices, stores, everything just had to shut down to stop the virus from spreading. But right on its heels came the second hit, an aggregate demand shock. Millions of people lost their jobs or income, nobody knew what was coming next, and so spending just completely dried up. And that right there is the big mystery we're going to unpack. The virus, it was global, it was everywhere. But the economic pain, that was not shared equally at all. Some economies just got hammered, while others, they still got hurt, for sure, but they managed to be a lot more resilient. So the big question is, why? This huge difference in the financial fallout is exactly the puzzle that two researchers, Carlos Carrasco and Edgar Tovar Garcia, wanted to solve. They dove into the data from 144 different countries to try and figure out what pre-existing conditions made some nations so much more vulnerable to the pandemic's economic domino effect. And this data just makes that difference crystal clear. Look at Italy. Their growth forecast got slashed by almost 10 percentage points. The US and Mexico also saw these massive downgrades. Now compare that to China. Yeah, the drop was still huge, but it was way smaller. It just goes to show the damage was anything but uniform. So the researchers basically became economic detectives. They started digging through each country's case file, looking for clues, specific things that were already there before the pandemic hit that could explain why one economy crumbled while another one just bent. And they were super smart about it. Instead of just looking at everything all at once and getting overwhelmed, they broke the problem down into 3 clear areas to investigate. First, they looked at what was going on inside a country, its domestic characteristics. Second, they looked at how it connected to the rest of the world, the external stuff. And third, they looked at what kind of tools it had in its economic toolbox to fight back. So first up, the domestic clues. They started asking questions like, does being a richer country automatically make you more resilient? Does spending a lot on healthcare give you a kind of economic shield? Or, on the flip side, does having an older population, one that's more dependent, create a bigger economic risk? Next, they moved on to the external clues. How plugged in a country was to the global economy. Was being a big trader a good thing, or did it just expose you more when everything shut down? And what about tourism? How much did an economy depend on tourists flying in? And it even mattered what you were selling to the world. Was it oil or cars or something else entirely? And finally, they looked at that economic toolkit I mentioned. When a crisis hits, how much ammo does a government actually have to fight back? Economists call this policy space. Basically, could they spend more money without kicking off a debt crisis? That's your fiscal space. And could they cut interest rates to try and get people spending again? That's your monetary space. All right, so after sifting through all that data from 194 countries, the researchers were ready to deliver their verdict. And what they found was really fascinating. It revealed a super clear pattern of what factors were a huge deal and which ones, surprisingly, weren't. And here it is, the single most important takeaway. There was no one-size-fits-all answer. The things that made an economy fragile were totally different depending on whether it was a high-income country or a middle-income one. What was a major risk for one was barely a blip for the other. Now, for the rich countries, the verdict was kind of counterintuitive. First off, being a big fuel exporter actually seemed to act as a buffer. It was linked to a smaller economic hit. But here's the real shocker. Countries that already had high levels of government and health spending before the pandemic were actually linked to a bigger economic drop. The theory is that maybe their public sectors were already so large, there just wasn't much room left to ramp up crisis spending. For middle-income countries, it was a totally different story. The number one thing that put them at risk? A heavy reliance on international tourism. I mean, it makes sense, right? When the planes stopped flying and the border slammed shut, those economies were just left completely exposed. And another big risk factor was already having a lot of government debt before the crisis even started, which really tied their hands when they needed to respond. And all of this brings us back to that key idea, macroeconomic policy space. It didn't matter if you were a rich country or a middle-income one of these single most powerful defenses you could have was just having the capacity to act, to cut interest rates, to pump money into the economy, all without causing a panic. It was all about having that room to maneuver. So, okay, why does it matter so much to look back at 2020? Because, understanding these specific weaknesses isn't just some boring academic exercise. It's literally the blueprint for how we can start future-proofing our economies and build a world that's more resilient for the next shock, because we all know there will be a next one. The researchers themselves really hit the nail on the head. They said that creating ways to protect our economies from crises has to be a top priority. And what's the very first step? You have to identify what makes you vulnerable in the first place. You've got to know your weaknesses before you can ever hope to fix them. So what this analysis really gives us is a much clearer map of the economic fault lines running through our world. Everything from relying too much on tourism to not having enough policy space. And it leaves all of us with a really critical question to think about. Now that we have a much better idea of what makes us fragile, are we actually getting ready for whatever comes next?